the gospel at the ballot box in the United States, Jesus is not merely a religious figure. He is also a political brand, a cultural weapon, and, too often, a commodity for sale. Candidates hold up Bibles at rallies, televangelists blend sermons with campaign messages, and churches become extensions of partisan machinery. While millions of Americans genuinely seek to follow Christ, his name is repeatedly invoked to capture votes and raise money. The phenomenon of holy votes. Empty Promises describes a cycle in which politicians appeal to Christian faith for electoral gain, only to abandon the moral principles they claimed to champion once in office. The promises of a Christian America serve as a mobilizing myth, more effective for securing ballots than for guiding governance. At its heart lies a troubling question. When salvation is packaged as a campaign slogan, what happens to both democracy and faith? This essay explores the historical roots of religious politics in America, the rise of the evangelical voting bloc, the economic machinery that fuels it, and the consequences of conflating Jesus with political ambition. Ultimately, it argues that holy votes often yield little more than empty promises, leaving both faith and democracy compromised. America's religious foundations. Faith as political capital religion has shaped American politics since its earliest days. The Puritans of New England described their colonies as a city upon a hill, setting a precedent for merging faith with national destiny. Leaders like George Washington and John Adams invoked providence to sanctify the fragile new republic, establishing a pattern of political legitimacy rooted in divine language. The founders debated the separation of church and state, yet Christianity remained woven into the nation's civic imagination. Religious rhetoric lent weight to revolutionary ideals of liberty and justice, giving politicians a vocabulary that transcended mere politics. Invoking Jesus or Christian principles was not only acceptable but expected. From the beginning, holy language carried political power, and faith became a form of capital in the American marketplace of ideas. Civil religion and the Cold War. A nation under God. The Cold War amplified the fusion of faith and politics. Against the atheism of the Soviet Union, American leaders positioned the United States as God's chosen defender of freedom. In God we trust was added to currency, and under God was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance. Jesus became part of the national brand. Politicians found that linking themselves with Christianity bolstered both domestic support and international legitimacy. Campaigns painted the US as a Christian nation, implicitly framing votes for certain candidates as votes for God's cause. This was less about theology than about branding. Jesus became shorthand for patriotism, anti-communism, and national unity. But the promises tied to this sanctification were largely symbolic. Beyond rhetoric, few structural reforms aligned with Christ's teachings on justice, poverty, or peace. The Cold War era thus set the stage for a pattern. Holy votes secured by religious language, empty promises when it came to applying those values in governance, evangelical mobilization. The rise of the religious rights. The late 20th century saw the formalization of religion as a political machine. The Supreme Court's 1973 decision in Roe v. Wade catalyzed evangelicals, who, under leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, founded the Moral Majority and other organizations. Churches became political headquarters, delivering voters en masse to conservative candidates. Jesus was reframed as a cultural warrior, invoked in opposition to abortion, feminism, LGBTQ rights, and secular education. Politicians eager to capture this bloc promised to legislate morality in line with biblical values. Campaigns explicitly linked salvation with citizenship, implying that to vote for the wrong party was to betray both God and country. Yet the promises often rang hollow. Despite decades of political power, the evangelical agenda produced limited legislative victories. Politicians reaped holy votes but delivered little in return beyond symbolic gestures and polarizing rhetoric. The bargain between pulpits and politicians demonstrated the transactional nature of selling salvation for votes. Televangelism and the business of holy. Votus evangelism transformed faith into a media empire and political force. Figures like Pat Robertson, Jim Bakker, and later Joel Osteen blurred the line between preaching and fundraising. Their broadcasts offered not just salvation, but prosperity, promising divine favor in exchange for donations. Politicians quickly recognized the power of televangelists, who commanded vast audiences and financial networks. Endorsements from religious broadcasters could swing elections. Campaigns appeared on religious programs, courting believers with promises framed as moral imperatives. Yet, as with televangelism itself, the promises often concealed a profit motive. Donations intended for spiritual growth funded luxurious lifestyles or political campaigns. Viewers and voters alike were told that their contributions, financial or electoral, would advance God's kingdom. Too often, the result was enrichment for leaders and power for politicians, leaving ordinary believers disillusioned. The prosperity gospel. Salvation as transaction. The prosperity gospel epitomizes the transactional nature of selling salvation. Its core message that faith leads to financial success leans neatly with the American dream. Preachers encourage followers to sow seeds of faith in the form of money, promising blessings in return. This theology mirrors political rhetoric, promising jobs, growth, and prosperity. Just as preachers declare Jesus wants you rich, politicians suggest Jesus wants this nation strong. Both spiritualize material success, framing it as proof of righteousness. In this worldview, votes themselves become investments in divine favor. To elect the right candidate is to align with God's will, ensuring blessings for the nation. Yet, the promises rarely materialize. Economic inequality persists, communities remain divided, and the poor, those Jesus most closely identified with, are neglected. Jesus on the campaign trail from Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush to Donald Trump. Candidates have invoked Jesus to secure electoral legitimacy. Reagan cast America as a city on a hill. Bush spoke openly of being born again. And Trump courted evangelical leaders despite his personal contradictions with Christian ethics. Campaign rallies often feature overtly religious imagery, Bibles raised aloft, prayers from pastors, and slogans equating political victory with divine blessing. The subtext is clear. A vote for the candidate is a vote for Jesus. But once in office, many of these leaders fail to deliver policies that reflect Christ's teachings on humility, compassion, or justice. The invocation of Jesus serves as a powerful campaign tool, but the promises attached to his name dissolve in the realities of political compromise and ambition. Churches as political platforms, churches protected by non-profit tax exemptions, have increasingly become political platforms. Pastors endorse candidates from pulpits, distribute voter guides, and host rallies framed as religious gatherings. Congregants are told their vote is not merely a civic duty but a spiritual obligation. To support the wrong party is to sin against God. In this environment, salvation is explicitly tied to political allegiance. Yet the cost of such politicization is high. Churches that function as campaign centers risk alienating members who dissent. Politically, communities fracture, and the universal message of the gospel is reduced to partisan loyalty. Holy votes are secured, but the spiritual health of congregations declines, leaving empty promises in place of genuine unity. The economics of holy vows. The political exploitation of Jesus is inseparable from its economic dimensions. Christian publishing, music, conferences, and merchandise form a multi-billion-dollar industry. Campaigns sell religious-themed memorabilia, crosses on hats, slogans like "Jesus Saves America," turning devotion into profit. Donations flow not only to churches but to political action committees, PACs, and lobbying groups. Faith becomes both a financial engine and a political currency. Politicians benefit from loyal donors, while religious leaders enjoy influence and wealth. But ordinary believers often see little return on their investment. Promises to restore morality, end abortion, or protect families rarely materialize. The economic machinery churns, but the faithful are left with empty promises, proof that salvation has been commodified as a product for sale. Cultural consequences. Polarization and disillusionment. The selling of salvation for votes has far-reaching cultural consequences. It deepens polarization, dividing communities along partisan and religious lines. Political opponents are framed as enemies of God, and compromise becomes betrayal of faith. It also breeds disillusionment, especially among younger generations. Many see the blending of faith with political and economic gain as hypocritical, leading to a rise in religious nones. For them, the gospel of Jesus is obscured by the noise of campaigns and fundraising drives. Holy votes may secure short-term victories, but the long-term effect is erosion of trust in both politics and vows, politics and religion. What remains are empty promises and a disenchanted public. Theological critiques. What would Jesus say? The exploitation of Jesus for political gain starkly contrasts with the gospel. Jesus consistently sided with the poor, condemned the pursuit of wealth, and spoke against hypocrisy. He overturned the tables of money changers in the temple, declaring that God's house should not be a marketplace. Were Jesus to walk American streets today, critics argue he would likely challenge both politicians and preachers who profit from his name. He would call out the transactional faith of prosperity gospel preachers and the opportunism of candidates who invoke him only at election time. Theologically, the message is clear. To sell salvation for votes is to distort Christ's teachings, trading eternal truths for temporary power toward a different vision of faith and politics. Despite the corruption of faith by politics, alternative models exist. Many Christians advocate for a faith that emphasizes justice, compassion, and service, rather than partisan allegiance. Churches dedicated to feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, and promoting racial reconciliation embody a vision more consistent with the teachings of Jesus. This vision rejects the sale of salvation for votes. Instead, it calls for faith that transcends politics, guiding believers to act justly regardless of party. It imagines a politics informed by compassion rather than commodification, where Jesus inspires integrity rather than campaign slogans. Holy. Votes MD promises the phenomenon of holy votes reveals the enduring power of religion in American politics, but also its profound risks. Politicians and preachers alike have learned to invoke Jesus for profit and power, selling salvation as a product to secure ballots and donations. Yet too often, the promises made in his name remain unfulfilled, leaving behind polarization, disillusionment, and cynicism. Jesus, the radical teacher who called for love, humility, and justice, is reduced to a campaign symbol. The sacred is commodified, the gospel commercialized, and democracy compromised. The challenge for America is to reclaim both faith and politics from this cycle of exploitation. True salvation cannot be sold, and true politics cannot be sanctified by empty promises. Only when Jesus is seen not as a brand but as a moral compass can the nation hope to move beyond holy votes and toward authentic justice.